And thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are proud to host Dr. Milliner from Wheaton College tonight. Matthew J. Milliner holds an MA and PhD in art history from Princeton University and a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. He is a 5-time appointee to the Curatorial Advisory Board of the United States Senate, and was awarded a Commonwealth Fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. He's written for publications ranging from the New York Times to First Things, and is author of The Everlasting People with InterVarsity Press in 2021, and Mother of the Lamb with Fortress Press in 2022. So let's welcome Dr. Milliner. Thank you so much for being here.
Folks, thanks so much for being here. Taking an evening to come out is a big thing to do, and I appreciate your coming along, and I hope that this is a benefit to you. And it's about this book, but it also updates some material that I've learned since it was published. So it was published at the end of last year. And I want to begin again by thanking you for being here and telling you a dramatic story that has to do with police activity. So let's get this going here. So there we are, just to get a little menacing there. All right. So why would an art historian be contacted by the police of Wheaton? Well, I noticed that there was a notice on my phone at the office in the summer of 2020 that indeed a detective wanted to get a hold of me. So initially I panicked, and then I thought, what you would think immediately, which was that this simply meant that there was an art heist in Wheaton, and that I was the consultant, and I was going to come in like Poirot and work the little gray cells and crack the crime. They needed an expert. So that was the hope, and that instantly vanished. And then I started to really get worried and think, is someone hurt? Is something going on? I'm dialing the number over and over again, trying to get a hold of this Wheaton detective. And then I finally got a hold of him, and his tone of voice signaled everything I needed to know. He was just like, relax, no one's hurt. You're not in trouble. That's all what I needed to hear. But he said, do you want to tear this down? And this is the Doughboy Statue in Memorial Park here in Wheaton. And I said, no. And he said, your students want to tear it down. I said, no, not that I know of. And he said, well, someone impersonating you is claiming to have an angry mob of students on hand, led by me, that is going to, and we're back online. And and then I was puzzled, and he said, well, the reason we weren't too concerned is because they misspelled your name. So it probably really wasn't you. So here's the story of what happened is that the week before, in that very heated summer of 2020, I had given a podcast interview in regard to the tearing down of statues. And the argument that I made, I would say it's simple. The mistake was that it wasn't simple enough. I made up a chart for it and everything. I said, look, it's really complicated in regard to taking down monuments. There are cases where monuments have been defaced in Christian history. Sometimes monuments are worthy of being destroyed, but the best thing to do is to debate them, maybe to detain them for a while. There's many cases of that. And maybe best of all, Frederick Douglass said, don't tear down that statue, let's contextualize it. The great Frederick Douglass said that. So I said, let's take the Douglass option. But what happened was this listener, all he could hear was, this guy wants to tear down Ulysses S. Grant, right? I guess that's what he saw. All of that nuance was not heeded. Imagine that in our time. and I was perceived in this fashion. And so he said, this guy, I'm going to make up this satirical letter, send it to City Hall, and that's why the police were contacted, because they wanted to protect the Doughboy statue from this renegade art history professor. So for the record, I don't think it should be torn down. This is the Bronzeville Victory Monument, which has an African-American soldier on the front. And I think that is an incredible connection. Bronzeville, of course, being the great African-American neighborhood in Chicago. And this connects us to that neighborhood in this beautiful way. I consider these conflicts of the 20th century to be legitimate interventions in imperial ambitions that are resisted by people who gave their lives. And so in some senses, I want to assert that, But I also want to say that this incident tells me, if an art historian is going to be contacted by the police, that this is a very difficult time to ask questions like the ones we're here to ask tonight. And I'm here to put this great author, GK Chesterton, in conversation with the indigenous history of this area. Essentially, you get to pick, right? Either I'm glad we beat them, I could care less about the many thousands of years, and some people have that perspective by default, or tear it all down, America's rotten to the core, it's all blood and murder to the base, and I want to erode everything in order to get to this reality. And I think this is a default assumption that people have, that we want to attack in a different way. Let me posit, just for alliteration, some other A's, right? Attending to the culture that was here before us, maybe even admiring it, and if not activism, activity, right? Activism seems to indicate that word for me, an aggressive attempt, which sometimes might be necessary, but the heritage of people like Frederick Douglass seem to say, no, let's have intelligent activity that can bring forth and honor the right realities. And so what I want to suggest in this evening is the goal, by trying to hit and it's hard to hit it right in the middle. It's easy to veer in one direction or the other. The goal is to live in this area more humbly and to increase our joy. Because initially there's a profound sadness that arises when one understands the history of indigenous people in this area. But when you push through that sadness and some of the self-centeredness that the sadness can be often connected to, one moves into this absolute elation and delight and almost transcendence that comes with living in this region of the world, this particular region of the world. I love Robert's definition of humility: transcendent self-confidence. Is it possible to live here with transcendent self-confidence? Humility is about acknowledging reality. And so what does it really mean that you and I, who happen to live in this area, and for those on Zoom, wherever you live, what does it mean to really ask those questions directly? So here's the breakdown of what we're going to cover. First, a brief overview of this book, then an investigation of the monuments that we hold so dear here, and then finally, a brief theological encapsulation using some new information that's come that I didn't have time to put in the book. I didn't find it in time, but it's, I think, the most exciting illustration of an idea that I tinkered with in this publication. And then we'll do that, and then we'll have time for questions. And I won't let you go without some practical suggestions as to how to move forward and where we are. So the first question to ask, and why everyone scratches their heads who bothers to attend to this project at all, is why Chesterton? Like, why not just go to some exciting new theorist who is attending to these issues of race and work with that person? And this is the reason. Because there's a sense in which I admire GK Chesterton, this great British journalist who was this prolific author, who never bored me, right? In all of my reading of him, which is something to be said, his collected works take up that much shelf space in Buswell Library in Wheaton, but he's always funny. And to have an original mind like that could write with that acuity and joy throughout his life is something to learn from. But the temptation was to find all the places where this journalist said things like Red Indian and say, I never want to read him again. Or find moments where he doesn't use words that I would use today. Like, I would not use the terminology of Red Indian today, but find other words and say, see, I don't want anything to do with him. And if I were to do that, I'd be cutting myself off from this author that meant so much to me. This author that so daringly interacted with the current events of his day that can fuel me to interact with my own. And he did so with his Christian faith at the center. I share that faith myself. And so I want to say, well, what if I worked with him? What if I resisted, we might say, the Oedipal rage to kill my father? So that's Oedipus, of course, Oedipus being the myth, this guy who it's prophesied that he's going to kill his dad, and he ends up doing that. And there's this, why don't we just get rid of all the authors that aren't up to date with where we are right now? And so instead of that, I said, what if I updated GK Chesterton? What if I used him to make sense of the indigenous people in this area? And by the way, I have no indigenous ancestry myself. And so I can still ask that question. And as I did so, I found it alarmingly relevant. So some of you know Yuval Noah Harari. He's an airport author. And by airport author, meaning 15 million copies sold. Barack Obama and Bill Gates, glowing endorsements, 50 languages. So this view of the world, and what's amazing about Harari, he just breaks down the silos of academic dispute where academics like me are taught to live, and he instead tells us the grand story. And that's why he's a good storyteller in that regard, which is why the human heart longs for that cosmic vision. And when he does this, he gives us a vision, a progressive vision of moving toward a technologically enhanced humanity. And this is from his website today. So I want to give you a sense, I'm trying to represent him as clearly as possible. How are his books advertised? This is his view of the world that has yet to be updated, which I find interesting. Over the past century, humankind has managed to do the impossible and reign in famine, plague, and war. Today, more people die from obesity than from starvation, more people die from old age than from infectious diseases, and more people commit suicide than are killed in war. The ink wasn't dry on that declaration before COVID-19 hit the globe. And now, against Harari's protestation in The Economist, and I'm glad he protested this, we are nevertheless stuck with this reality of sinful human beings doing what they do best. And we are stuck with this, and I'm faced with the failure, we might say, of Harari's vision. Human rights are just an idea that we've invented, Harari says in his YouTube talk with millions of views. Just an idea we've invented. That's a very convenient thought if you want to override those human rights. And I want to say, if this has been found wanting, Chesterton was there first. Because H.G. Wells wrote The Outline of History in 1919. The full thing was published in 1920. And Chesterton read this and he smelled the same progressive vision. Let's leave war, famine, and fraternal strife behind. And what Wells argues in this masterful big story is we're just going to leave war out because, of course, they had just been through the Great War, the war to end all wars. And we'll have, let's imagine, the United Nations, the Fraternal League, where we'll just decide we won't fight each other anymore. And we'll leave all that primitive fighting behind us. And Chesterton looked at this and he saw that it was a bestseller and he said, you're forgetting the reality of human sin. You're forgetting the fact that original sin is the stone that the utopianists rejected, that is always going to be with us. And he wrote The Everlasting Man in response, 1925. And you can see that's why the book is called The Everlasting People. It's riffing off of this. And in The Everlasting Man, it's really worth your time. It's that sweeping view of the vision, but with the suffering servant at the center. And so he has this eye for the underdog. He would be defending the Ukrainians with great force right now if Chesterton was writing, because he would say, that's what my country, the British, did to the Irish. And that's what you, Americans, me, did to the Red Indians. He sees that. And so I want to pursue that vision. I want to take it further. A dangerously optimist view of history he sees in H.G. Wells, which is the first cry of imperialism. Very interesting. So at a time where people are leaving primitive man behind, right? All those indigenous people, advanced to be Europeans like the rest of us, people are dismissing cave art and saying, well, I mean, first of all, people were coming along and saying, it can't be that old, 15,000 BC, it could never be, it must be a forgery. And also, well, it's not really that good. And Chesterton's like, oh, it's good. Art history peaks at about 15,000 BC. And he says, what's the lesson? Sorry, anthropologists, sorry, ethnologists, sorry, folklorists, I don't like your theories. They're not that interesting, because what's the lesson? That you could dig a long way and find a place where a man drew a picture of a reindeer, which we found. You're going to have to dig a lot deeper to find a place where a reindeer drew a picture of a man. The lesson is that, and all of the science backs him up, that has recently been this advance in consciousness that no one can explain that causes art to occur, right? He sees that and he says, no, H.G. Wells, that's not something we're leaving behind. That's something we have to return to, that vision. So he has both a depressing view of humanity in a sense, but also a glorious one, because humans are made in the image of God. And so talk about a view that can help us to make sense of the indigenous people of this area, but can it, right? Because there's really no native culture in Illinois, right? It's just, there's nothing here, right? Well, this is from a field manual that the Illinois Archaeological Society puts together. A few people who live in just this one section where we are, northeastern Illinois, realize that we have a rich prehistoric and historical heritage. Archaeology, people think, well, I got to go to the Art Institute, maybe the Field Museum. No, there are thousands of recorded archaeological sites, to say nothing of the unrecorded sites. So you might say, wait, thousands? Yes, thousands, ranging from 13,000 to 100 year old, where we are. Most people don't realize that. I did not realize that. I'm stunned to understand that still, that this is an area. Why do you think Arrowhead Golf Course is called what it is, right? There's a lot of people around here for a very long time. Yeah, but did they have art like the Europeans? Yes. So this is Picture Cave, published in 2015, a glorious publication in conversation with indigenous people and archaeologists, unpacking this wonderful series of paintings in Missouri. This is a little south of us, and I'll tell you more about it in a moment. And let me warn you, it's not good news. And then Hidden Thunder is this great book, great coffee table books by him, of artists interacting with all the Wisconsin cave art that is out there, much of which we can't visit because we don't want to destroy it with our carbon monoxide that comes out of our mouths. But nevertheless, you can see the pictures, it's even better in this book. And so we say, wow, we're living on a canvas? Yes, we are. And so I go to children's books like this one, which is, it's just, this is it. There's the picture, right? That's where you live. You live in a land where the glaciers are receding, right? Have receded, thank goodness. And those lakes are the meltwater of that extraordinary curtain, a curtain that was so thick that it would cover Willis Tower at its height. And that curtain lifted back in that great period of the glaciers receding, didn't touch the driftless area, which is why they have elevation, but it definitely was here. And that is a curtain lifting on the drama that you and I are participating in, and that the indigenous people participated in long before us. And what a drama it is. Your ancestors probably have a great story that you may or may not know. And if you don't know it, please pursue it. Find out that history, learn about it. But this is a heritage to be envious of. That during that glacial recession, you have people following the megafauna, big game. You catch one mastodon, you're feeding your tribe for a month. All right, so you'll do what it takes. You'll gather together in bands and figure the technology to get it done. And there are risks along the way. I learned about this book by Craig Childs from John Wilson. And they tell us he goes to the places, to Beringia, to where the crossing occurred. And he says, well, what would you be up against? I was worried about grizzlies when I was up there. But what they would have been worried about are grizzlies that would eat the grizzlies we now know of as snacks. That's how big they are. I mean, you are Skittles before the real meal, okay? And he thinks about this, and talk about an adventure that the people who lived here participated in. They have that in their DNA. They got through this guy to get here. It's a journey, it's a battle. And all of the research is out now. Listen to the crazy farmers that call you if you're an academic. That's what Jim Adivasio learned, because this crazy farmer who wasn't crazy in Pittsburgh kept saying, yeah, I think I found a native site on the farm. It's like, ah, whatever. Everyone didn't pay attention. Well, Jim Adivasio finally paid attention and blew apart the Clovis dating that we used to have for how long humans have been in North America. And so what I want to say, Clovis, isn't it cool? Like New Mexico, that's where all the cool native stuff is, right? Down the Southwest. Well, that is the Clovis site, is what the era used to be named after. So if you found a Clovis spearhead, oh, it must be like 10,000 BC, amazing. Wow, it's Clovis in Santa Fe. Well, now we know that there are enormous amounts of sites in this area that blow Clovis apart. It started with the Miller Point discovered by Jim Adivasio at the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania. And now we've got some. 15,000 years ago, you can go find a site, it's right across the border, of a mammoth with, now I call her Katy Perry Mastodon. That's my wife's nickname because she's female. She's female. So we have a mastodon here in Wheaton, but this one, which is on display in Milwaukee, has clear human carving marks on it. So we know that humans were carving this thing up. And that's 15,000 years ago, 13,000 BC, that this has been dated to. So that tells you about this habitation around here. You can see it with your own eyes. Everybody's talking about this, these massive new books. This one's getting all the attention, The Dawn of Everything. I think this one is a little more helpful personally because it's got all these wonderful charts and it's written by a woman who's indigenous herself. And what she has done, Paulette Steeves, is taken all of these new finds. You might be like, well, how do I know where they are? She has said, let me help you to let you know how long my people have been around here. And if you look at her map of these pre-Clovis sites, guess what? We show up. The Perry Mastodon site is on her map. So this area for her, this is sacred territory that I want to know about as an indigenous person. And it's a territory that we are guests upon, that we enjoy and that we live around. So guess who's wrong? He's a great writer, but he's wrong. Nathaniel Hawthorne, no author without a trial can conceive of the difficulty of writing a romance about a country where there's no shadow, no antiquity, no mystery, right? Just commonplace prosperity and broad and simple daylight. That's nice and all, but romance and poetry, you need wallflowers and lichen and ivy. And so I've got to spend the money to go to Italy. And that's where I'll become a writer. He didn't know it was all here, right? Why? Because we suppressed it. This is the continent that you live upon. Crowded with beautiful things made by people, made in the image of God, if you share Chesterton's perspective. So, love this guy. I have an Atlatl. I did not bring it. It could get dangerous. But an Atlatl is a spear thrusting device. It's a technology that predates the bow and arrow. And if you want to get better and better at piercing mastodon skin, you need to get really good at throwing. I don't think I would be the best hunting partner. I would probably miss the man. Oh, Milliner lost another arrowhead, you know. Okay, but some of you might really get good. And so what I want you to do is look at that motion, and next time you're at Wrigley Field, think of the great tradition, right? We honor people who are skilled. Well, back then it's because they got you dinner, right? Okay, I mean that ability to hurl overhead in this extraordinary way. And these Atlatls, you wanted to get good at it, so then you started to say, all right, well, I want a really nice, fancy piece of equipment. And so they said, well, no, I'm going to strap a little weight to it to give it some extra thrust. Imagine that. Got this Atlatl, you got a spear on it, and you've got a big, almost like half a bowling ball here. Wow, you're going to have some piercing power there. And so, but you don't just want an appendage, you want it to look nice. And lo and behold, these are stuck in storage at the Art Institute. They're from the time of Moses and David, and they are abstract, beautiful, and exceeding what the great modern art of the 20th century accomplished. Brancusi's famous sculpture that overlooks the Gary Pritzker Pavilion in Chicago right now at the Art Institute, and stuck in storage is something that's that good that was made thousands and thousands of years before. Okay, so that's the Chestertonian vision. And you might get excited about that and say, that's wonderful. I want to go to Picture Cave. I want to go see, in this case, 1,000-year-old paintings. And you can't. You can't. Nobody talked about this. Missouri Cave, filled with ancient artwork, sold against the Osage Nation's wishes. All the Osage wanted to do is continue to have access to the site, but we auctioned it off for $2.2 million, the land that it's on, and attempts to broker some kind of relationship did not come through. And so what I'm simply suggesting, I hope that the people who bought Picture Cave, which was well published, right, with these beautiful books that tell you all how important and what the mythology means, I hope they bought it to save it and to be in contact with the indigenous people and to let people like us in to marvel at this 1,000-year-old history. But I don't know. I don't know. Can you imagine selling off Chauvet Cave in France to the highest bidder? Chauvet Cave, 30,000 BC, Cave of Forgotten Dreams, the great Werner Herzog documentary. Well, we just sold off ours. So I don't think we're sufficiently attentive to this reality. I hope someone's found their dream home, but I also hope they share it because we seem to be letting this indigenous culture slip away. Let's talk about a little, a nicer story about what we've got around here. So a lot of you will know the Winfield Mounds. And this couple, Brian and Joyce Osberg, have done amazing work in a series of absolutely free YouTube videos. And I gave it to Daniel Master, who is the archaeologist at Wheaton. I said, look at these videos, they're pretty amazing. And he is a professional archaeologist doing the largest dig in Israel right now. He's like, this is incredible. They've single-handedly annihilated rumors. There used to be rumors, oh, did you know that Wheaton College desecrated the mounds and threw the baby bones away? That's just simply not true. It's not true. And there's rumors going around. It's illegal. And these wonderful researchers have unfurled the exact history, exactly what happened in regard to these mounds. And so I recommend them to you to learn about what's in our area. They're really fantastic. But I'm going to give you my take. And my take about our mounds here is that, my goodness, you look at early maps of Chicago, 1820, right? Before the skyscrapers, or the sky gropers, as W.H. Auden would call them, okay? And that looks a lot like the West Branch of the DuPage River Park, where the Winfield Mounds are. And so, thank goodness, to the accidents of preservation, one of these big sites that testifies to this long history is here, not far from us. Are there any in Chicago? Destroyed for the outline. No, they're not. Are they here? Yes. You want indigenous culture? You're going to get to it a lot quicker if you live here than if you lived in the city. And so what's amazing about this site, I'm going to call it DU33, DuPage 33, which tells you there's a bunch of other sites, 33 before that and many after that we don't know about, or maybe you know about, but I want to go explore, okay? They are anchored to two of the most important parts of what we might call Midwestern indigenous history. So let's talk about what those two parts are. There's enough settlement in this mound. So 200 BC to AD 300 is the first wave of culture that I'm talking about. And then 700 to 1100 AD, that there's that many people over that long of a period inhabiting this area that it connects to two seriously important moments in indigenous culture. Let's talk about what they are. We should have these on hand. I think it's fair to say if you live in this area, you should very well know these because it's exciting. If you lived in Cairo, you'd know about the pyramids, right? Well, you live here. Okay, so Havana Hopewell, what is this? Okay, Havana is just a town in northern Illinois, and Hopewell is just a farm. So we named it after Hopewell the farmer, where they didn't call themselves Hopewell, but this is a major indigenous culture and this is the northernmost expression of it. And so this culture was all over the Midwest, and we are up here an outpost. So you can see the Havana Hopewell there, the Ohio Hopewell here. And to give you a sense of the awe that this culture can inspire in us, I'd like you to imagine getting buried and saying, and let's imagine you say to your spouse, they say, what would you like in your coffin? Oh, well, I'd like how about this? Can you get me a grizzly bear tooth and a great white shark tooth? But can you get that by hand, like finding the animals on your own? That would be quite a request, right? I mean, not like go to the store. No. Actually catch a great white shark and get a grizzly bear. I mean, a tall order, but that's what they did. There are grizzly bear teeth and great white shark teeth, to say nothing of obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, quartz from the Ozarks, and marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico in a tomb in Chillicothe in Ohio. And you probably never heard about it. Unbelievable. Talk about honoring up, you thought the terracotta army was interesting. That's a little more interesting. Because this, just some fantasizing about having an army in the afterlife, not that interesting. This, that's interesting. The whole land is lying to rest with me as I contemplate what might be after death. Wow, that's what those mounds are. They're testifying to this hope of some possibility beyond death. And then, now look at this for a moment. Not as impressive. That's the remains that we found in the Winfield Mounds. So I'm sorry to say we have no grizzly bear teeth, and the pottery is not that exciting, but it does give you a sense that the same kind of burial practices were going on here. Now, in regard to this Hopewell culture, these earthworks in Newark, Ohio, are the largest earthen enclosures. Again, these earthworks that the Winfield Mounds are connected to in a peripheral fashion, okay? They are the largest earthen enclosures in the Midwest. Is that not amazing? No. They're the largest earthen enclosures in North America. They're both false statements. They're the largest earthen enclosures in the Western Hemisphere. Now that would be impressive, but all of those are false statements. They're the largest earthen enclosures in the world. And they are saved by golf courses. And you have to drive to different parts of them if you want to get a full sense of these extraordinary mounds. And what are they doing? We know. They're testifying to the rebirth and renewal of the world and all its living things in these ceremonies. And as a person who believes in the resurrection, and sometimes is talking to contemporary people who don't believe in that, or to people with a Platonic view of the world or want to go off, I'm like, these are allies, right, for me. I like this idea. These people are testifying to the hope of a body that comes up again in a way. And that's why they are so reverential in their treatment. And when my wife had a difficult pregnancy with our second child, and it was touch and go there for a while, I learned just how traumatic that can be. And I remember, I will never ask this question to a physician again, but I said, my wife had preeclampsia, and I looked at the doctor and I said, "Ooh, if this is preeclampsia, I wouldn't want to know what eclampsia is like." And he just looked at me with these eyes that testified to decades of experience of people going through this. And I'm like, "Oh, that joke did not fly." Because, I mean, and so we got through this trauma. And I remember looking at my wife and seeing she was sleeping, the still raised womb that had already delivered the child, as with the sheets over it. And then I looked out across the way and I realized I was right in view of the Winfield Mounds. And I thought of the earthen wombs that are hoping for a life beyond. And as I held my son, I thought about that, right? That's what the Winfield Mounds are. They are to be honored in that way, or not. Now you'd think here is where I'd come along and say, "Oh, isn't this awful settlement? Chicago, isn't it bad? Look at all the grids and cutting down all the mounds." But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this. These are the grids that were erected by indigenous people in the Corn Kingdom of Cahokia, which rivaled Paris and London in its day, in its population. And those grids that are cutting into the sacred earth are menacing if you are on the bottom of this society. Chesterton's right, unfortunately, about human nature, because when power accumulated in the structure of the Cahokia chiefdom, at Mound 72, the archaeology tells us, and forgive the dramatic illustration, but it's done by Herb Rowe, who did it with great precision for a purpose. You have human sacrifices of women, 4 at a time in a public ceremony. And then on another occasion, the archaeology tells us 7 humans at a time in a public ceremony. And then 19 people were ritually strangled. And on one occasion, 24, and then 39, and then 53. The human heart seems to be rather insatiable in its longing to see things destroyed, to see humans destroyed. And so I simply want to suggest that those grids did not require Europeans to come in and impose them. That indigenous society, we cannot romanticize it. It has its own corruptions. But let me ask you, how did it go down? There's new research in this area. We're not quite sure. Some of the earlier theories have been disregarded. Was it warfare, drought, or disease? We're not quite sure. But Cahokia collapsed on its own before any Europeans came along from, I think we might use the word, corruption of one kind or another, or violence of one kind or another. And permit me this, okay? I'm not an archaeologist, and it's a great disciplining of the intellect to be one, but I'm going to take what they've given me and I'm going to imagine with you for a moment. Can we just imagine, I think the data permits this, that our Winfield Mound Native Americans are refugees from that corrupt kingdom? It's not impossible, right? I'm going to canoe my way up the Mississippi, into the Illinois, DuPage. Okay, let's get as far away as possible. East, well, let's go to the west. Okay, but as I get there, we're safe here. We're safe here. It's possible. We don't know enough about them. So that's interesting, right? That it covers the Havana Hopewell and even distantly connected to Cahokia, which was around for a while. That came a little bit later. But this is the most exciting thing. They're also connected to the Effigy Mound culture. And the Effigy Mound culture comes later. Some of you will know the Effigy Mounds Park along the Mississippi. You got to go to it. And these are earthen prayers. That's what they are. That's how the archaeologists describe them. Beautiful anamorphic mounds of these different beasts that are trying to get a message out there, up there, we might say. I don't want to idealize the Effigy Mound culture. They had some human sacrifice as well. But what I will say is that it does seem to be the case that Cahokia would go up the Mississippi, would colonize and take people from the Effigy Mound culture back to their kingdom, possibly for sacrificial purposes, I'm not sure. Possibly for enslavement, it's hard to say. That was certainly practiced. And they also went up to Wisconsin. You've probably heard of Aztalan. That's a colony of Cahokia in Wisconsin. So we have this rich interaction of these different cultures, and feast your eyes on that image. That is our area, and it is covered with mounds. Winfield Mounds just happens to survive, but just reimagine this territory as filled with these playful memorials, sometimes with humans within them, imagining the animals and in this conversation with heaven. And we know that they had a cosmology of heaven above and the underworld below. And of course, we did this to their culture. And I could make you feel bad, and I could feel bad about that, and it's sad. But you know what? It's coming back to life. This is the plan for a Thunderbird-shaped school at Forest County, Potawatomi in Wisconsin. They're going to build it in the shape of a Thunderbird. What's that? The mound's coming back to life. You're living through it, right? It's already happened in Wisconsin amongst the Iroquois. That is a turtle-shaped middle school. That's where I would have sent my kids, the turtle-shaped middle school, right? And at the heart of the turtle, they teach the Iroquois language. This language is coming back to life in an extraordinary way. Even nearby, an indigenous artist, Santiago X, right around the corner from O'Hare, you've got a recreation of the mound culture. And then long before this one gets some recent attention. Anyone been to Buffalo Rock? Okay, so Buffalo Rock State Park. What have you got here? In the 1980s, you had an artist who took the spider mounds here and recreated them, and you can walk around and enjoy them. And so you're living through a renaissance. What a delight to be a part of that. Don't move, stay here. This is where the action's at, okay? Let's move toward our conclusion here. Because I know this is a lot. My wife keeps telling me, you come on strong, slow it down, but nevertheless, we're gonna push through. We're gonna push through. So what do we do with settlement now? Right? Oh, that's where all the bad stuff happens. This is where these evil people come along, and then that mentality of and there is evil. Richard Twist, a great Native American author, says, we would have done it to you. If we had bigger canoes, we would have done it to you. And he says that from his perspective as a Christian Native American, because he believes in that Chestertonian notion of original sin. He knows it could have happened. And so I don't want to celebrate this only. I don't want to lament this only. But how can I not attend to it? It's how my ancestors got here. And so what do we make sense of it? So what I want to simply suggest to you is get your mind around this current, not this one, okay? Because this is French country. And I want to talk briefly about Father Marquette and two things that he saw on his trip. And this is the image that I wish I had been able to include in the book. And so I'm talking about two sites. One's in Alton, Illinois, and one is in Utica. So let's talk about the first one. This, again, to go back to that children's book, that's Marquette's country. Marquette is a teenager. He gives his life to Christ. He becomes a Jesuit. He says, I want to go to North America. They say, wait, study the languages. He does that in Paris, and then he goes on to the St. Lawrence River, and he's all the way up in Lake Superior. He's mastered 5 indigenous languages, and they tell him, yeah, there's a big river down here. You might want to go find it. And so he does. And he's got traders on his back, but his interests are in the kingdom of God. And I genuinely believe that our Marquette building, which we almost lost, may not be perfect, but it's astonishingly egalitarian in its glorious depictions of this missionary and the way he honored the native cultures. The Illini took more possession of him than he took of them, one Marquette scholar says, recently. And so when we look at this mosaic that honors him, and we see this image in Chicago of Marquette holding up the calumet, that's the peace pipe. That simply means they gave this to me because they said if I held it up, you wouldn't kill me. And so they put their bows and arrows down because that's an instrument of prayer. Tobacco is prayer. And so he holds that up, and he has this interaction with the natives of this area, and he sees this image, not that one in particular. This is contemporary Alton, Illinois, recreating what Marquette might have seen. And this is an underwater panther, which is one of the creatures in indigenous cosmology. We make light of this. This is a mascot for us, right? It's the hodag in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. And that's all fine and good. But what I want to suggest, and the argument that I make in the book, is there's a way to think about this creature is as the process of settlement. The numbers were so overwhelming that the premonition that so many indigenous people had, we are not going to survive this. And therefore, when I think of this monster, I don't think cute, I don't think selfie, I don't think quirky museum. I think we made fun of these monsters and their mythology and said they don't exist. But slowly, that interaction that Marquette had that was positive began to erode. By 1699, which is the most important date for me to remember, to try to understand this area, by 1699, that era of interaction between the Europeans and the indigenous was expiring, and the Illini language dictionary was stolen because the Indians needed to become French first. Be French. You don't have the right to have the gospel in your own language. Fast forward, you see where things are going. This is the second treaty of Prairie du Chien in Wisconsin in 1829, where the area that we now live on is ceded, is sold. Sometimes people say, oh, it's awful, we live in stolen land. I don't want to insult the Native Americans that sold it by saying they got hoodwinked. I'm not sure that that is an accurate statement to say we live on stolen land. I'm not saying that they were ideal circumstances, but when I talk to my Potawatomi friends, they say, hey, I mean, come on, we did what we could. And so it's complex, our connection to this land. We can go into this in more detail, but the point is, at Prairie du Chien, ultimately, they cut a deal in the wake of how many of my ancestors there were. And it's shortly thereafter that the one Indian that resisted it, Black Hawk, is hunted down along with his tribe. Please don't ever romanticize Black Hawk. It's an indication that one has not read his autobiography, where he claims that he would love to eradicate all the African Americans with the sterilization process and that he would love to annihilate the entire Cherokee Nation. It's right there in his autobiography. He's not a figure that we need to lift up. I mean, again, that Chestertonian idea. But what he does see is that his attempts to resist this annihilating force of these people is nothing is going to work. When he gets his tour of Philadelphia and the East Coast, he's like, they're here and they're not going away. And it's then that Wheaton gets its first settlers, after that clearing out process was complete. And so what I want to call attention to this is Warren Wheaton. In June of 1838, I made my claim where I now reside, right after the Black Hawk War, 2 years before the government survey was made. And what I am suggesting here is I want to honor Warren Wheaton, and I want to honor the hardship of settlement and the work that that entailed, but it can also be a part of this process that was seen hostilely as those who were here first. And if that sounds like a stretch, the same year, 1838, that the first settler cabin is built in Wheaton, we forcibly ejected 800 Potawatomi on an ethnic cleansing trail that we now call the Trail of Death. And so that date, which you'll see on homes in Wheaton, can mean both of those things. You don't have to pick. It can mean both of those things. And if it saddens you, you can, in 2023, journey with the Potawatomi who honor the Trail of Death and those who died upon it. I've done it with them in 2018. It's an extraordinary journey. Are they bitter? Are they angry? They want us to know. They want us to know that those of us who tried to stay here, you ejected us. And so that's sad and that weighs our hearts down, but let's end with the good news, because there is some. This is the thing I didn't know about. This is, gosh, it's the discovery of my life. You all probably knew about it, but no one told me. Okay, so this is the grand village of the Kaskaskia. And that is where in 1673 and then again in 75, Marquette encountered 1,500 Kaskaskia Indians in the grand village of the Illinois. The archaeology tells us they ate elk, they ate bear. So just think about this area with elk and bear to eat, okay? And they listened with relish to what Marquette had to say, and they celebrated the Mass with him. So they heard this gospel and they gave him a gift, and this is the gift. It is a glorious buffalo hide of an abstracted thunderbird that is languishing in storage at an anthropology museum in Paris. And the Peoria tribe of Indians, who are their descendants, they should have it back, right? It's like, it's just, look at this. This is the culture. Shortly after that successful mission with Marquette, the Illinois came in an aggressive, hostile expansion prompted by white settlement. That, that looks like imperialism to me. And they beat down the rest of the Illini Confederation, and that mission that Marquette started in this area in Utica was no more. But the Thunderbird still is. So you can find the Thunderbird at Rocha Cree State Park. There's a petroglyph there. You can find the Thunderbird in contemporary Indigenous art, and the Thunderbird is the enemy of the underwater panther. That's Indigenous cosmology in a nutshell. There's these hostile forces in the world, call them what you will. Any ethnicity can be connected to them, right? But the Thunderbird is going to overcome them. And it fascinates me how sometimes the Thunderbird has Christian resonances in some Indigenous artists. No different than here in Chicago. This is the Cattery Center, and there is the Thunderbird at their altar. That is a Christian worship center in the city of Chicago. To conclude, let me say, this is Sylvia and Rachel Hall. They were kidnapped in a conflict in this area that led to the Black Hawk War. And the story is told that Sylvia, she's kidnapped as a teenager, and as she's being dragged away by these Potawatomi, she notices her mother's hair on a scalp. True awful violence between the ethnicities in this area. Sylvia and Rachel Hall, they get a pass in asking the questions we're here to ask tonight. I'm not going to say, now tell me about the way you've thought richly about the dignity of Potawatomi life. It might not be their job, but I'm not sure we're off the hook, right? So much has happened since then, and we can ask these questions. We can just say, well, the Cahokia Indians, they conquered, and now we conquered because there's our aggressive grids, right? Whether it's North Avenue or Roosevelt. But the beauty of this is, you know the story of Wheaton, right? It's a dip, right? It's not a straight grid because the Wheaton brothers said, hey, we'll give you free land if you get the railroad to dip a little bit, right? And so Wheaton doesn't fall into that grid. Wheaton can approach things in a different way. Practical tips, let's conclude. This is a powwow in Ottawa, Canada. And I remember going to it and experiencing this tradition and looking over the tent and saying, wait a second, there's a church right there. So it's almost like the powwow itself became a church. And then I realized, walked over, well, that's actually a Ukrainian church. It's the Ukrainian Catholic shrine of John the Baptist in Ottawa. And when you go into this shrine, you'll see beautiful frescoes of the Ukrainian Christian tradition. And you'll see this image of Pentecost, which reminds us of all the different cultures of the world gathered together. And instinctually, most of us right now say, it's awful what is happening to that country. You can't just say, you're part of us. You can't squelch and suppress the dignity and wonder of that culture. And if that's true, then this might be true as well. You might say, well, that's a picture from the powwow. You might say, well, I can't go to Ottawa. You don't have to. The Soaring Foundation, they have a powwow every year. Theirs is coming up in September. My wife and I joke that our kids went to more powwows before they were 4 than we did before we were 40. And that's all the nations gather together to celebrate. So put that on your calendar, September 17th and 18th in Naperville, and interact with the Soaring Foundation, become a member. I just became a member today. I've been talking about it, finally ponied up. So that's, let's do it. And travel, save the money to Europe. That's probably the only selfie took in Oklahoma at the Peoria tribe, right? It's like, it's not the Eiffel Tower, but go, and we have some work to do, right? Our Glen Ellen fresco that's memorializing the native culture maybe needs to be freshened up a bit. And that doesn't mean taking down Doughboy statues. But let me suggest this in our closing 2 minutes. There have been some great renamings in our country. Great renamings. Intelligent, thoughtful, deliberate. Probably the best renaming of all was the miraculous renaming of Harney Peak that is now called Black Elk Peak. Harney being the butcher of the Lakota, and I have a family connection to that, so I say it with a heavy heart. I write about that in the book, but Black Elk being probably soon to be canonized Catholic Native American saint. And so those renamings have happened. And so a simple question. Winfield Scott, a sinner like all of us, supervised the Trail of Tears and the Black Hawk War. With 15,000 years of human settlement in our area, is that the best name we can think of for DU 33? I called the Park District. I asked about it. I think they were nervous that I was like one of the doughboy guys. And I learned that it was, and they do wonderful things, the Park District. They're the right people to talk to. But I did learn that it was chosen randomly in a lottery, the name Winfield Mounds, randomly. Maybe we can think of a better one. And yet, thanks to the Park District's cooperation with the Soaring Foundation, I show you a more excellent way. And let's conclude by going from the West Branch. We're in Mesopotamia here, of course, in Wheaton, between the West Branch and the East Branch. And we go to the East Branch, and what do you see? Churchill Woods. And that is where the Potawatomi were ejected, 500 of them, while they waited for our ejection policy to go into effect. And right there by Stacy's Tavern, we might say, oh, isn't it awful? It's so depressing to live here. No, it's not. Because in December, the Soaring Foundation had their first equinox celebration. They're trying to do something creative and exciting with the site. And the next one is coming up March 20th. You could go. You could go participate in that and be a part of this Renaissance. Yeah, it'd be nice to live in the Quattrocento and see Greco-Roman culture coming up from the dead, but you get to do it here. Folks, thank you so much. I'll stick around for questions. If anybody wants to buy a book, they're back there. I'm happy to give you them at cost. The money goes to support the Wade Center. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. So we're right on time, which means anyone should feel free to go or stick around for questions or comments, because a lot of you might know more about this than I do. I'm new to this territory. Yes, Barry. Absolutely. Thank you. I will do that. So anyone, really, again, I really appreciate your being here. I hope it excites you about this area. Go ahead, please.
So, Matt, do you think the Hopewell in Ohio getting such exotic things like a shark tooth, was that a function of trade, or were they actually getting to the coast? I mean, that's you know what, the question was the Hopewell in Ohio. They have all these items. I made it sound like, and was it a question of trade, or were they doing individual missions for the burial? You're absolutely right. I was making it sound like there's this individual kind of hunting trip or fishing trip, which would be fun. But indeed, their trade network, thanks to those rivers, was everywhere. Think about that. The Ohio is your highway. And that, of course, in the Treaty of Greenville was intended to be the barrier, the boundary that was violated between the indigenous people in here. And then the Mississippi and the Illinois. Once you understand these rivers, you really get a sense of the richness and the history of this area. Just the railroads and the highways are one thing, but of course, once you get that, you see how those trade networks would have been possible, and why Marquette, as he's going south, has to stop right after St. Louis, because they say, you're in a Spanish country, you're going to get killed, you're French if you go down there. So he loops up and then goes back into this area. So really, the rivers are the key, the watersheds are the key to getting it all. That's such an important point, and I'm really glad you brought that up. I think the maritime history there.
Oh, there. River Horse is a William Least-Heat Moon book, the guy who wrote Blue Highways, where he just goes on these river trips. Like, why are we spending money to go on like the Rhine River vacation cruise? Great, but I mean, you can do it here, right? You can do it here, but we just don't honor our rivers enough. We have Joel Cheesley, the great painter, who has honored the Fox River with his extraordinary paintings and discovered what we have here. There's a Rhine River mysticism tradition in Europe. The great mystics like Meister Eckhart all along the Rhine River and Hildegard of Bingen. Well, why don't we have Fox River mystics as well? So let's do it. Let's do it. Any other questions or comments about this? Any terms I need to unpack? Go ahead.
So
Are the Thunderbird and the underwater jaguar, are those symbols that are specific to the Ohlone culture, or are they more regional? How wide
Yeah.
is it?
So the question is, are the Thunderbird and the Mishipeshu, the underwater panther, underwater jaguar, you can call it that too, are they universal, or are they specific to the Illini? What's amazing about them is their universality. It does seem to be a lingua franca, forgive the term, of mythologically of this entire area. So you'll see it amongst the Ojibwa. If you go up to the Minnesota Science Museum, you'll see indigenous Christian beadwork for Episcopal liturgical ceremonies right next to a pot from like 1500 years ago that has the Thunderbird and the underwater panther in combat with one another. And so that's where I go to this. And and so what's fascinating is that when indigenous people become Christian, often they will bring the Thunderbird with them. Parts of their culture they will want to reject, such as human sacrifice. Like every culture has to go through things of rejecting things in that baptismal process. But the Thunderbird makes it through. And so Christ is connected to the Thunderbird. And once you get that, a thunderstorm will never be the same in this area. This is the time of year where the thunderstorms begin. We've already had two, you may have noticed. And that's in the constellations of the indigenous view of the world. They have, of course, their own constellations. The Thunderbird emerges just at this time of year. And so there's this beautiful dance between the upper and lower world, which matches onto, not perfectly, but somewhat onto a Christian view of the world. So that's what's funny. You will find the Thunderbird almost everywhere, which is really exciting. Yeah, that's why for me, it's the key. Because I'm like, how do I think about, Chesterton loves myth, and he does this with the European myth. He's like, it's not all pagan. It can be good. It's honoring to God in some senses. He says Carthage, that's bad paganism because they did human sacrifice. So for Chesterton's Carthage is our, I would say, Cahokia. And then his benign Virgilian paganism, right, would be the Thunderbird dimension. Yes, sir.
Just along those lines with the Thunderbird, do you think that came from the indigenous side of that came to be associated with Christian ideas, or was, I know some places the Christians would map their concepts onto existing traditions. So did it go both ways in your study of this, or how?
So the question, which is the mother of all questions, is, in an exciting way, is to what extent is this a Christian contribution, like, well, or is it indigenous reception? And it's in some ways a wonderfully impossible question to answer, because you could say, let me put it this way. Oh, well, have you ever been to a Christian Eucharist service? Wine, come on, you're just worshiping Dionysus in disguise. We know what's going on. You really worship the wine god, don't you? I know, because you have wine at your services, right? End of story. What a boring view of the world, right? Well, there was beating of slaves and orgies connected to the cult of Dionysus that Christians said, all right, we don't like that part. But this grape god thing, oh yeah. Oh yeah, the dying and rising again thing. Oh yeah, oh yeah. And you can find the chalice of Antioch at the Metropolitan Museum of Art has Jesus looking a lot like Dionysus, the god of wine. Does that mean that they're pagans in disguise? No. It means they've taken the best of this culture and honored it. And so the answer to this question is, in some senses, the Thunderbird is this honorable part of indigenous culture that you see at the Cattery Center in Chicago continues to be front and center in Christian worship, not suppressed, not muffled, but at the heart of it all. So that question is what we get to enjoy in all of our studies, because it's always an exciting answer. Anybody else? Thoughts or questions? So, March 20th, you could be there. You could be there. You've got a long adventure ahead of you if you live in this area, of visiting these sites, of learning about this culture. I hope this book can help. I hope this has helped tonight. And what a blessing to be able to be guests on this land as people have for already 15,000 years. Thanks, folks. Thank you.